Coming up, there is a global financial system that gives poor countries the power to improve their economies and rebuild after climate disasters. But that's only in theory, and debt is a dangerous weapon of the wealthy.
Climate vulnerable countries are just being handed off with more loans that they then need to find a way to repay.
A new report looks at the way fossil fuel subsidies work and how high corporate emitters wield a country's own public funds to stifle action on the crisis.
The fossil fuel and industrial agriculture sectors are not only causing the climate change, but they're also draining public finances.
And the injustices that thrive in these desperate circumstances.
Women, Teresa, it is clear that we cannot solve the climate crisis without them.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that part of the story out.
Just 2 degrees is on now.
So many policies just assume men are the default farmer, men are the default human.
We've covered climate finance many times. That's the funding needed to equip a country to withstand the growing threats of the crisis and recover when disasters do hit. But a new report by ActionAid is revealing what seems to be an insidious plot to prevent any meaningful action in communities that need it most. The report is titled How the Finance Flows Corporate Capture of Public Finance Fueling the Climate Crisis in the Global South. And it reveals that the oil, gas and agriculture sectors are draining developing countries of hundreds of billions of dollars in public subsidies annually. Money that could have been used to improve climate infrastructure and strengthen local communities.
I think the last time we spoke, you were at the Bonn Climate Summit in Germany in June. You said fossil fuel companies were crossing their arms, turning their backs, refusing to talk real numbers on climate finance. Before we get into the new ActionAid report, talk about if anything positive has happened since the Bonn Climate Summit as it pertains to climate finance.
Well, there was a meeting last week, a technical expert dialogue, where governments met again for a slightly less formal but still important discussion to try to put the building blocks in place about climate finance. And we really saw the same mode that we saw last time at Bonn Climate Talks. Rich countries just refusing to talk real numbers and really trying to count every single kind of money under the sun as climate finance, when we know that what we really need as climate finance are grants rather than loans, rather than private finance investments, etc. You know, we know what we need. And right now, rich countries are still playing hardball and not really recognizing how serious the situation is and the key part that finance plays in resolving the climate crisis.
In Africa, as in all regions, the climate crisis is an economic sinkhole, sucking the momentum out of economic growth. In fact, many African nations are losing up to 5% of GDP as a result of climate impacts.
So the new report that's released by ActionAid says, it starts by saying, quote, "The world's money is flowing in the wrong direction." What does that mean exactly?
You know, the world's money is going in the wrong direction because it's fueling the climate crisis in a number of ways. So one clear example, as we've just been talking about, the wealthy polluting countries of the global north have provided very little real money as climate finance to the countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. Africa, Asia, Latin America have done, you know, relatively little to cause the climate crisis, but every year they're repeatedly paying the cost themselves every time a drought strikes or a flood hits or a destructive cyclone passes through. And that's why we need COP29 to agree an ambitious new climate finance goal in the trillions when the world's government meet in Azerbaijan later this year.
The G20, the biggest emitters, with the greatest capacity and responsibility to lead, must be out in front. And the world must massively increase finance and support for vulnerable countries. We need a surge in funds to deal with the surging seas. At COP29, countries must agree to boost innovative financing and a strong new finance goal.
So as ActionAid, every year we release a new report called How the Finance Flows, so that we can better understand what is really happening with these finance flows. And our research last year looked into what the banks are doing. In that, we found the world's banks have been channeling hundreds of billions to every year to the fossil fuel and industrial agriculture industries in the global south. This year, we've released a new report and with research looking into how public finance is flowing in the global south. And in particular, we looked at subsidies and public investments. And we made some pretty shocking discoveries. In this study, we found that the fossil fuel and industrial agriculture sectors are not only causing the climate change, the land grabs, the deforestation, the local pollution that harms countries and communities of the global south, but they're also draining public finances from those very same climate hit countries while not really serving people's needs for food and energy.
So there are 600 million Africans without access to electricity, and Nigeria is the largest, has the highest rates of this unelectrified population across Africa. So Nigeria has the potential, but it is being hampered by a range of constraints, including financial and policy constraints at the moment.
ActionAid has described this as corporate capture. But I mean, historically, subsidies are used by governments to help lower the price of food and energy. But talk about exactly how subsidies by these fossil fuel companies and agriculture companies are actually used.
So governments might subsidize fossil fuels to lower the price of electricity, or they might subsidize chemical fertilizers so that farmers can access them more easily. And what we found is all of that money that governments are giving to these industries, instead of giving to climate solutions, over $600 billion every year. And for context, that is a lot of public money. That would pay for primary school education for every child in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, 3.5 times over. That's a lot of money is going to those industries that are themselves very wealthy. It's also 20 times the amount of climate finance that global north countries are providing to global south countries, which really highlights how climate finance is insufficient. It's really a drop in the ocean and simply not enough to help countries, you know, release themselves from the grip of these industry. I mean, our research also found that renewable energy is you know, severely underfunded, shockingly underfunded, and that actually the renewable energy is only receiving public financing that is 1/40 of the money that fossil fuels are getting from public subsidies.
True, we are using more renewables, but they are in addition to the fossil fuels. There's virtually no, if there may be actually no substitution between renewables and fossil fuels at the collective level, at the global level. And the climate does not care about efficiency. It does not care about renewables. It only cares about CO2 and other greenhouse gas molecules. And as we burn more fossil fuels, the temperature will continue to rise.
I think one of the stark truths that I've realized covering this climate crisis, Teresa, is that countries are very disconnected from each other. Quite often, people in the north, in the global north, don't necessarily care about what's happening to people in the global south. So you cite fossil fuel subsidies take away from public education on the African continent. But do you get the sense that people around the world care about these individual issues so that we can fight this collectively?
There's a cognitive dissonance between recognizing there's a crisis and understanding what we have to do to fix it. And money really is at the root of all of this climate upheaval. We really don't see a recognition, even in the wealthy country governments that say they care about climate change, but they don't seem to want to pay for the action that's needed. And we really need climate finance to help global South countries, release themselves from the grip of these industries and start to make that transition so that they can better channel their public resources into solutions.
Well, surely this is a lot easier said than done. According to the ActionAid report, governments' hands are tied basically in the global south. For example, the report says obligations to earn export dollars for debt repayment to the International Monetary Fund enables the fossil fuel and industrial agriculture sectors tighten their grip on these economies, preventing climate vulnerable countries from making rational decisions. This is, again, incredibly frustrating because you and I have talked before in the past about debt restructure, debt cancellation. How much does debt play a role in the global south not being able to tackle the climate crisis?
More and more countries are in debt distress. They're in debt distress because of the climate crisis, because they're being pushed deeper into debt because they need to pay for the recovery and all the losses that happen every time a climate disaster happens. And so when instead of getting climate finance or loss and damage funding, for example, to recover from these disasters, climate vulnerable countries are just being handed off with more loans that they then need to find a way to repay. So that's when they go, well, how are we supposed to earn the foreign dollars in order to repay these debts? Usually the advice they're given from the IMF is expand your fossil fuel industry, expand your industrial agriculture industry in order to earn those dollars to repay back that debt.
54 countries are now facing potentially debt distress. That's essentially a step away from not being able to pay the interest or even to pay your debts.
Sí hay un deuda ecológico, económico que tienen los países del norte con países como el Ecuador. Árboles acá, ¿no?, que son tan críticos para mitigar el cambio climático, están tumbándolos para exportar más petróleo, que es una de las cosas más perversas y más daño para el cambio climático.
Yeah, and according to the report as well, fair reparations are calculated at $192 trillion by the year 2050, or $5 trillion a year to the global south until then. And that is granted that everything else is equal, that we actually meet our targets by 2030, and there is heightened renewables. Can this realistically be done? Or are we looking at another 5, 10 years, 20 years possibly, of an escalating crisis?
Well, we need to change the political climate to do so. And we know that that's really, really a challenge. We know that so far, wealthy countries are simply not willing to make the moves necessary. But we also know that we have achieved miracles before in climate negotiations against all odds. Last year, even though the negotiations were in Dubai, an oil producing country, the world did agree to transition away from fossil fuels. That was a significant moment. And the year before that, the world did agree to set up a loss and damage fund, which rich countries had refused to do all these years.
If this is an existential threat, if we have to reinvent our energy economies in the next 10 years, then let's remind ourselves, total wealth in the world today is actually $430 trillion. Are we really unable to direct public and private financial flows to the tune of $1 or $2 trillion, in essentially saving humanity and our economies from extraordinary disasters that are beginning to manifest themselves already?
What do we want? Just transition! What do we want? System change! No transition! No system change!
Women and girls are the primary caretakers of their families. We are at grassroots. We are being impacted most by climate change. Why not consider us, put us in leadership positions that will empower us to become climate leaders, put our needs and demands into these processes, invest in our initiatives.
Women, Teresa, it is clear that we cannot solve the climate crisis without them. But according to the report, policies and practices in some countries assume that men are the only farmers that count as farmers. How do we overcome gender ignorance and talk about something that the report mentions called feminist just transitions?
In lower income countries, we see that women in rural farming communities tend to have far more responsibility for fetching water, cooking, growing the family food, whilst at the same time having less access to finance, having less access to land ownership or access to community land. Women or girls are often pulled out of school before their brothers when money is tight. Women skip meals before their husbands. So that is why women and children are 14 times more likely to die when climate disasters happen.
And by 2030, over 340 million women and girls will still be living in extreme poverty, some 18 million more than men and boys. This is an insult to women and girls.
So when you shape a just transition, let's say from industrial agriculture and fossil fuels to the real solutions such as renewable energy and agroecology, you need to do so in a way that really listens to the most marginalized people and make a particular effort to make sure that women's needs and opportunities are met in that. And by doing so, if you roll out a just transition carefully, that makes sure that there is the right sort of social protection, that there are alternatives in place that people can really access and afford, and you make sure all of that is in place for energy needs, food needs, livelihood needs, then that's how you can make a just transition fair for women.
Is this issue about women's limitations when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis and in farming, I guess, is this like a global patriarch issue, or is this very specific to global South countries?
There are these entrenched roles, cultural roles that women usually take on, and that then they become invisible. So like local policy making will assume that it's the men, that it's the the experts in the community are men who should be shaping their local planning, and who just simply don't think to invite the marginalized women who may have lower access to education, who may have a lot less confidence to speak out and share their views, and certainly wouldn't feel in many cases able to sort of waltz into a community decision-making meeting and tell the community leaders what they think. We recognize that there is a real issue of empowerment that often is part of the challenge, blocking women from shaping local policies, and so that's why as ActionAid, our work really makes sure that we work when in communities, we work with women and create process that build their confidence, build their empowerment, build their ability to talk about the challenges they face, and their willingness to sort of tell people in power about what they need to hear, and then actually implement those changes themselves. So we center women's leadership as a central part of our farming work, of our adaptation work, of our humanitarian intervention work. We make sure that there are women first responders who really make sure that the people who are most marginalized are taken care of first. And so, a feminist analysis is part of everything we do and should really be standard in all government practice.
Quite often in these conversations, you get the impression that governments are in league with these fossil fuel companies and want to do harm to their own economies. But the report says that global South governments are trapped in this exploitative and ultimately self-harming relationship with the fossil fuel and agriculture, industrial agriculture sectors. How does a developing country stand up to an international lender or a fossil fuel giant?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very tricky power dynamic, isn't it? I mean, the industries have far more control and power over many of these countries. Many of these countries, they're so beholden to debt that they don't feel they have any option except to work with these industries in order to repay their debt. And then these are what they're told are the future, are the development. This will make the country wealthy. We see over and over again that it's simply not working for people. And then you can speak to many other people in developing countries working in governments, and they're super keen to get on a renewable energy train. They're super keen to scale up agroecology, but they simply can't find the ways to shift the finance, or shift the policy. And so what we really need is a combination of international climate finance to help, start to unlock that transition. And also, as ActionAid, we work, as I said, in all of these countries, and we're really supporting everyone from community to organizations and activists to articulate and to put more pressure on these questions of public finance, because we really have found through many years of working as an NGO in the Global South that by putting the spotlight on how public finances are being spent, we can really make a difference.
I've got to say, Teresa, I went through this report, very somber, but I came to a paragraph toward the end that actually made me smile. So it goes, if the top third most climate vulnerable countries increased their tax to GDP ratios by 5 percentage points, they could raise an additional $341 billion every year. So there is hope that these countries can actually help themselves to some degree.
Many Global South countries right now would love to raise taxes on the biggest corporations, but you may not be aware of this. Very few people are aware of the fact that the global tax framework has actually been decided by the OECD countries, the club of rich countries. So the Global South is unable to tax wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals in the way that they would like to. That means they're unable to keep the profits that these fossil fuel and industrial agriculture corporations are making from them. They're unable to use those profits to pay for climate solutions, to pay for education or health. Instead, that money is being, sent back to the headquarters in the global north and actually making shareholders in the global north wealthy. So shareholders in fossil fuel and industrial agriculture corporations in the global north are actually basically squeezing public money from the global south. But there is hope, because there are now UN negotiations for a new UN framework convention on tax. We have to take the global tax framework out of the control of the wealthy countries and make it a more fair and equitable process where all countries have equal voice. But we are hopeful that within the next few years, we will have a global tax convention that really allows countries to do what they need to do to tax the wealthiest corporations and individuals.